Good morning. My name is Robby Wilkinson, and today I'll be talking to you about the supply side of piracy. So to do that, let's look at some previous legislation. In the decade previous to the turn of the century, there were two key pieces of legislation in the United States. They were the Audio Home Recording Act of 1992 and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998. The Audio Home Recording Act was passed in 1992 and was a response to digital recording devices. While this bill was good for the entertainment industry in that it made recording devices have anti-copying systems, it also made the industry angry because it said that the companies making the devices could not be held liable for the devices being used for copyright infringement. Like I said, that made the media industry pretty angry. It wasn't what they wanted, so they moved for a different option, or what they called Plan B, or the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act forced nearly every recording device to have a new form of copyright protection called Digital Rights Management, or DRM. And it made it illegal for any user of the machines to recode or break the DRM systems. But what's most important about the DMCA is that it created something called the Safe Harbor provision, and that limits the liability of online services. The Safe Harbor provision is what allows websites like YouTube and Vimeo to operate. It pretty much says as long as the site tries to filter illegal content and the site tries to block access to infringing materials upon notification of infringement, then the websites are pretty much free from liability. So basically, when a rights holder says, hey, that infringes my copyright, the site has to take it down. The website is also free from liability if the user uploading the content claims that it does not infringe copyright. So, as long as the website does all of this, they're free from liability. Viacom, a media company, is currently in a series of legal appeals with YouTube, saying that YouTube has been infringing a lot of Viacom's copyrights. But in multiple hearings, judges have ruled in favor of YouTube, claiming that they are covered by the Safe Harbor provision of the DMCA. This is very important because the supply-side bills that are currently being attempted by U.S. legislators plan to bypass this Safe Harbor provision. The DMCA is also significant because it's the last time that media companies try to manipulate the United States legislature into executing their will about copyright infringement, until recently with a bill called COICA, or the Combating Online Infringement and Counterfeits Act. But this is a list of all the supply-side anti-piracy initiatives. So let's define what that is. Those are any legislative work that attempts to remove copyright-infringing websites from the internet. And the first one was called COICA. COICA was the predecessor to the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect IP Act, or SOPA and PIPA, and it shares nearly all of the same qualities as those two bills. It was introduced in 2010 and attempts to censor any website that might infringe copyright, even if the complainant doesn't have any evidence against the website. Because the bill is so similar to SOPA and PIPA, we'll come back to the three bills collectively and what they mean in a minute. But Senator Ron Wyden said he would stop at nothing to make sure COICA didn't even see a vote in the Senate, and he was successful and shot down COICA. The next one was called ACTA, and that is the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. ACTA is a multinational treaty signed by the United States and 30 other countries, including the European Union and 22 of its member states. It hasn't been ratified, only signed, so it's not in effect yet. And supporters of the bill claim it does not change United States law, but it does make inducement illegal. Inducement is the facilitation or enabling of copyright infringement. Though ACTA's main purpose is to clarify the processes against copyright infringers, the language used in the treaty is vague and can be interpreted in multiple different ways. ACTA also completely ignores copyright exemptions like fair use and public domain. Ignoring fair use is more of a problem internationally because luckily the United States already has a fair use policy clearly in place, as Catherine Boyd will talk to you about more tomorrow. A major problem with ACTA is that the signatories of the treaty see it differently. For example, the United States sees it as legally non-binding, which means Congress does not have to approve it. But European signatories see it differently. They see it as legally binding. And opponents of the bill question its constitutionality in the United States because the Constitution clearly expresses that any legally binding treaty must be passed and accepted by Congress. Though supporters of the bill say that it doesn't change U.S. law, so SOPA and PIPA are actually a direct result of Congress trying to comply with the Act. Like I said, the main purpose is to clarify the process against copyright and intellectual property infringers. But the main problem is the language is so vague that it really fails in its main purpose. So let's move on to SOPA and PIPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect IP Act. The Protect IP Act is actually short for Preventing Real Online Threats to Economic Creativity and Theft of Intellectual Property Act. So, such a long name. I guess they had so much time on their hands. SOPA and PIPA were created by media companies and supported by them as well, including the Motion Picture Association of America, or the MPAA. What SOPA and PIPA would have done is they would censor not only those websites that they believe are infringing copyright, but also any website that so much as provides a link to those infringing sites. To do this, they would have to force Google, Bing, and other search engines to change their algorithms that they use to provide users with search results. We're about to look at a bit of legalese taken directly from SOPA to see how vague the language is. And as Chris Heald of Mashable said, these bills are written to obscure the truth. If ever a bill was spaghetti, this is it. So this looks like a giant chunk of legal text, but we're only going to be focusing on this red bit here. So at first glance, that looks sort of alright. Just glancing at it, you might think it says you are considered to be dedicated to the theft of U.S. property if the primary function of the website is to infringe. But if you look closely at the text, it doesn't say that. What it does say is you could be considered dedicated to the theft of U.S. property if your site offers goods or services that could facilitate or enable infringement. This means that any website with a chat room or a comment box, or even email providers like Gmail, could be considered dedicated to the theft of U.S. property. So what happened to SOPA and PIPA? Well, they were widely protested by the internet and internet users, with Wikipedia going dark on their English page for 24 hours, Google blacking out their logo, and Reddit going dark for 12 hours. The bills were eventually sent back to committee indefinitely, only to be rewritten later. And that bill is actually already here, and it's a demand-side bill called CISPA, or the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, which actually sounds pretty good because it sounds like it's going to stop the government from being under attacks, like cyber attacks. We'll only touch briefly on CISPA because it deals with more the demand side of piracy than the supply side. But it's interesting and relevant because it's what happened in the aftermath of SOPA and PIPA. So it passed the United States House of Representatives on April 26th of this year. CISPA wants to share your personal information with the government if you're accused, even without evidence of infringing copyright. But there have been amendments proposed to the bill to stop this secondary point, which mainly focuses on intellectual property theft. However, the House Rules Committee has banned all discussion of the amendments, and this secondary point has been reinstated into the bill. Opponents have called CISPA the new SOPA and PIPA because, again, the bill lacks a clear, concise definition of what is considered a cyber threat. So again, you might be liable even if you might infringe copyright. Fortunately, Barack Obama has threatened to veto the bill if Congress decides to pass it. So let's look at how these bills work. In all cases of these supply-side initiatives, they identify sites that significantly infringe upon copyright. They then force the Internet Service Providers, or the ISPs, to remove the websites from the domain name system, which is the system by which computers identify websites. This is a major oversight of SOPA and PIPA and all of the other bills because there are more ways to get to a website than using the DNS. Another thing these bills are trying to do is cut off the funding supply to content infringing sites. They would give the rights holders the power to take any monetary supplier to content infringing sites to court for damages. The same is also true for companies like Google and Bing, who would be liable for even providing a link to an infringing site on their list of search results. So any accused website would lose any funding from, say, Google AdSense or PayPal even. So what happened to all these bills? Well, eventually most of them were defeated, and the U.S. legislators sent the bills back to committee indefinitely, but only to be rewritten and redrafted into similar but different pieces of legislation. I know a few of you are probably thinking, hold up, none of these have passed. That's true, but history has taught us that Congress is going to keep pursuing this type of legislation, especially because it has to be in compliance with ACTA. We saw this as COICA was shot down and ACTA was signed. SOPA and PIPA rose to take its place. And as SOPA and PIPA were shot down, CISPA entered the scene. While the three on the left-hand side have all failed to pass, it is the two on the right that we have to be most concerned with, because they're still being worked on by legislators and still being introduced to the public as a whole. But there are some pros to these bills, and a slew of supporters behind them, including lots of media companies, including film industries, television industries, and even the music industry. But notice that they are mainly industry bodies, mainly but not only. But note that the companies you won't see are internet companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. So why did they support these bills? Well, the list of pros seems great. It might hinder piracy, might make it harder to obtain illegal content by giving the government control over copyright infringing sites, which in turn might boost revenue for the entertainment industry. That sounds lovely, but the first so-called victim of these bills was Mega Upload. In January of this year, Kim.com, the founder of Mega Upload, and 3 of his employees were arrested in New Zealand on charges of inducement from the United States. Shortly after that, other file hosting sites, or file locker sites, began to reevaluate and reformat themselves. In the aftermath of the Mega Upload takedown, services similar to Mega Upload, like FileServe, FileSonic, Uploaded2, and Videozer, all stopped third-party downloads, and Uploaded2 even went so far as to ban all Internet Protocol, or IP addresses, from the United States from accessing their site. However, not all of these sites reformatted themselves, including RapidGator, who was temporarily shut down this week by their host, but it's just by their host, so they're searching for a new one and will be up again shortly. As you can see from this graph of RapidGator's traffic rankings, it seems that many pirates moved on to other websites. So you see from December, when it was relatively low in search ranking, to present day where it's a lot higher than it was. Also, in a survey I conducted with random consumers of media, these were the results. So these bills didn't bother them. The threat didn't really affect their piracy habits, and it didn't find it harder to obtain illegal content. But it's important to note that this is probably not a representative sample. And also, it's just everyday media consumers, including people in this room who may have a sort of bias against piracy in general. So that brings us to the cons of these bills. There's not enough safety against false accusations. The websites accused only have 5 days to appeal any accusations made against them, which is not a lot of time to bring a legal team up to speed. As we saw before, language used in them is vague. As we saw before in the big chunk of legalese from SOPA and PIPA, the language is just, it can be interpreted in multiple different ways by any judge. As I said earlier, they bypass the safe harbor granted by the DMCA, and they supersede existing privacy laws such as freedom of information and freedom of speech. Because search engines would be disallowed from putting the accused websites in their search results, they would essentially be under a gag order. But most worrisome of all the cons of the bills are the unintended effects. So let's go to the first and arguably the funniest of the unintended effects. This is Lamar Smith. He's the author of the Stop Online Piracy Act. And this is Congressman Smith's website on 18th of January 2012. Notice this nice background image of the forest and the trees. Well, that's actually this image, taken by photographer DJ Schult, who had no idea his image was being used on the website, and nobody had asked him. So, by his own laws, if they were in effect, Congressman Smith's website, and any websites he had apart from that, would be removed from the domain name system, and he would be subject to further action. Talk about hypocritical. Now, moving on to something a little closer to home. Carlos, can you disable the capture, please? Guys, if you could not tweet this upcoming section on Justin Bieber, then I'd really appreciate it. So this is the Biebs. This is the video that started his career. Love him or hate him, Justin Bieber makes over $100 million gross profit per year. And he has a net worth of $125 million. So he brings in tons and tons of money for the music industry. Well, Bieber was found on YouTube, as were all of these people, including Arnel Pineda, who is the current lead singer for the band Journey. Notice that these are not only musicians, but also producers like Kurt Hugo Snyder and actors like Jessica Rose and Liam Sullivan. YouTube is a means of getting noticed and discovered by the industry. A lot of users like Christina Grimmie start by uploading videos of themselves singing renditions of other artists' songs, which is an infringement of copyright. Justin Bieber started the same way and was discovered when his manager clicked on a link of the video we just watched, which was Alicia Keys' song Fallen. So in 2007, Justin Bieber went from being just some kid with a YouTube channel to being signed and being a worldwide sensation. So why am I telling you all this? Because these supply-side bills would bypass the safe harbor given by the DMCA. They could destroy YouTube and any website like it. This effective means through which artists try to get discovered would no longer exist. Now, the chances are slim that the government would take down YouTube over one flimsy little complaint. But there are over 60 hours of video uploaded to YouTube per minute. And that seems like it would be a whole lot more than just one little complaint. As managers, the death of YouTube could mean missing out on top-selling artists like Arnel Pineda and Justin Bieber. But it's also much more than that. We'd be losing a very precious marketing tool on the internet. Every day, the industry is uploading music videos, film trailers, and more onto websites like Vimeo and YouTube. Songwriters and bands are uploading sound files to SoundCloud. Real photographers are using Instagram as a marketing platform. All of these websites would be lost to us because, as we saw from this slide earlier, these bills are not aimed at the facilitators of copyright infringement, but at those websites that even offer a service that might allow you to infringe upon copyright. But websites like YouTube, SoundCloud, and Instagram are not going to be the only websites to fall victim to these anti-piracy initiatives. Social media websites, as well as almost any forum or website with comment boxes, could also be taken down for inducement. Now, I've heard people say, oh, the government would never take down a site as big as YouTube or Facebook. But if legislation remains vague and open to a lot of different interpretations, it won't matter what the intentions of the bill were. All that will matter is how the judge or judges on the court case at hand rule. YouTube certainly doesn't share the view that it can't be taken down, with their public policy director, Bob Borston, saying YouTube would just go dark immediately. It couldn't function. The problem with online piracy is too big to ignore. Congress cannot stand by and do nothing while American innovators and job creators are under attack. This quote shows how Congress is going to keep working on initiatives to stop online piracy and intellectual property theft, which is great. But it's up to us, the potential future influencers on intellectual property legislation worldwide, to stop and think about not only the intended effects of the legislation we support, but more importantly, the unintended effects, because it is the unintended effects that can have serious, unintended consequences on our industry. Thank you very much.
some people, I've lost the voice by the way.
I'll shout it out.
Just so we don't might know what the safe harbor is. Do you explain that a little?
So the question is, could Robbie explain the concept of safe harbor?
The safe harbor provision of the DMCA, let me get some notes up real quick. It's pretty much a provision of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in Title II of it that says that as long as you try to remove illegal content or infringing content from your site, then and as long as you as long as the users that upload the content says that the content is not infringing copyright, then the website is free from liability.
Thank you. Kat?
You mentioned briefly about domain names and how they can just get rid of that and stuff, but how does it work with like IP addresses and stuff? Because can't you kind of type them in and then still get to where you want? So if Google.com was taken down and then you use Google's IP address, you can still get to the search engine.
Yes, and that's the major flaw. The question was, sorry, Maria.
Sorry.
The question was the domain name system and why is that section of these anti-piracy initiatives flawed? And that's because there's more than one way to get to a website. Most of us would just type in, google.com. But the domain name system changes that into something the computer can understand, which is numbers, an IP address. So 74.235. Blah blah. But even if they remove Google from the domain name system, you can still get to it by typing in the IP address. And if they block that, then you could get to it from the hexadecimal address, which is another way of getting. And if they block hexadecimal addresses, then you could get to it from proxies, which make it look like you're in a different location. So it's deeply, deeply flawed.
What happens to sites outside of the U.S. jurisdiction?
Outside of the U.S. jurisdiction. Sites within the U.S. jurisdiction, if you're accused of infringing copyright, then the operator of the website would be liable. For example, lipa.ac.uk is, their operator is the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts. So their website, as well as any other websites that they own, would be taken down and subject to further action. Websites outside of the United States jurisdiction, they can't really do much about except for take action against the website itself. So because they have no jurisdiction over the creator of the website or the operator of the website, they can only take action against the site itself.
Why do you think Congress has listened more to the film, music and TV industries than Google or Facebook or Wikipedia or something?
That's a very good question.
The question from Elliot was, why do we think that the government in America has listened much more to film and music industry, etc., etc.? Why is the power with them? And not with these huge, new, but very big players like Google? Why is the power being with those traditional players, I suppose, in the market?
I think that's really a question of opinion. But I would say something very, very generation biased. I would say that the older people in the Congress would be not as willing to change. So they've been relying on these media companies for decades. Why should they change to Google and Facebook now?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Robby.